So, a bit of potentially deep lore that might not really amount to anything. So, I've wondered whether or not this make contact gesture is a kind of reference to Hotei and the moon. So, let's it's pinned in the Discord somewhere. Let me look it up real quick. Okay. Perfect. Let's jump to this post. So this is called Hotei and the Moon, and it's kind of hard to tell from this angle, but he's kind of making like a make contact gesture in this screen specifically. But the story behind it is, let me find that link. Oh, yeah, I could just post it into chat. That's a thing I can do. If you guys want to look at that on your own sometime. The full moon Zen is something about Hotei. So we have like images of like monkeys looking at the moon and water. And so to the perspective of a monkey, they might not be able to differentiate the moon and the water from like the moon and the sky. So that's kind of like a Buddhist thing to represent like the thing that you're looking at isn't necessarily like the proper way to follow something. And that kind of ties back into like Hotei. So you might confuse like his finger pointing at the moon for the way to like follow to the moon. Well, hold on. I said that poorly. Like pointing to the moon could be mistaken as like the way for going to the moon. But what you need to do is look at the moon yourself, not the finger that points to it. Kind of like the way that the monkey looks at the moon in the water instead of like the moon itself. But even beyond that, the moon that's reflected into the water is still sort of the moon to a certain degree. So like things reflect off of each other, which makes finding the way more difficult. So the way is kind of in all things, but it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time is kind of like one way to look at it. And that's kind of my personal interpretation on it, or my one way that I'm paraphrasing it, and I'm certain others would disagree. But let me read this verbatim. Misperceiving reality, the monkey fixates on an illusion. The reflection in the water, like everything else, depends on a constellation of conditions. The instant the moon sets or other conditions change, the reflection will disappear. It has no independent existence. Still, we cling to the things we have and strain for the things that we want. Suffering ensues. The Buddhist concept of delusion encompasses mistaken views, ignorance, self-deception, and mental illness. Another painting that takes its cue from the moon. Hotei is pointing to the moon as the inscription attests. His expression is so rapt, there's almost no need for him to point. Fugai takes full advantage of the colors of ink painting, blah blah blah, to make a point. The central metaphor is well known. Language about ultimate reality is like a finger pointing to the moon. Ultimate reality goes by many names in Zen: mind, Buddha, Buddha nature, and so on. Hotei signals a goal, a direction, and by extension, a path. But don't mistake the finger for the moon. Another analogy comes to mind, teaching a dog to fetch. The first time you throw something and point to it, the dog may mistakenly jump at your outstretched hand. So that's kind of a good example right there. But to tie that more specifically back into the Bloodborne, I think it's very interesting that we do this gesture to get the moon rune. Because
signature with
the term menses comes from Latin, and while many people think of menstruation, the reason menstruation kind of gets its name is because it's tied to the lunar cycle, and menses essentially means moon. So it's the school of the moon. And when we meet the brain of Mentis, the brain of the moon, I guess, not really, we do this gesture to symbolically perhaps point to the moon, which I think is to show like, hey, we're looking for enlightenment. And I think the brain understands our goal with this gesture. And I think this is literally the brain speaking to us. And I think the brain is trying to say moon to us because it understands what we're like looking for. And like the moon is the ultimate goal of the school of Mensis, which I think they're using the cries of Murgo to summon the moon presence to the world, which is why things are going awry in Yharnam. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. And again, this is like some super House of Cards stuff where it's just all built up on like very weak foundations, but I think they're interesting enough that, you know, it's a House of Cards. It's not the most stable thing in the world, but there is kind of structure to it.